What if I told you that most women never reach the level of pleasure their bodies are actually capable of? Not because there's something wrong with them, but because no one ever taught men the one principle that changes everything. I know that sounds dramatic, but after years of listening to couples in my clinic, men quietly, frustrated women secretly thinking something is wrong with their bodies, I realized the real problem was never desire chemistry or compatibility. It was understanding, a simple misunderstanding about how the female nervous system builds and releases pleasure. And once that clicked for my patients, their relationships transformed in ways they never imagined. As a doctor, I've seen women who spent decades feeling disconnected from their own bodies suddenly describe sensations they didn't know were possible, not because they tried harder, but because their partners finally learned how female arousal actually works. That shift alone turned insecurity into confidence, tension, into closeness, and routine intimacy into something far more powerful. And here's the part I need you to hear. It's not complicated. It's not a trick. It's not a performance. And it has nothing to do with lasting longer or being more skilled. It's a rhythm, an emotional and biological rhythm that any man can learn once he understands how arousal rises, pauses, and rises again. If you've ever wondered why some women describe pleasure as waves rather than a single moment, or why certain couples seem to share a deeper electric connection that keeps growing stronger, there's a reason for that. And in a moment, I'll show you exactly what it is. But before we get into the science, I want you to keep one question in your mind because it will shape everything you're about to hear. What if the real secret to overwhelming pleasure isn't intensity, but timing? I've spent years sitting across from couples who look perfectly compatible on the outside, yet carry a quiet tension they don't know how to name. And it almost always starts the same way. He thinks she just can't get there, and she thinks something is wrong with her body. But when I look them in the eye and tell them the truth, that most of the frustration they're feeling is actually the result of a biological misunderstanding, not a lack of chemistry, the entire room changes. Their shoulders drop. Their breathing softens, and suddenly, for the first time, they're hopeful. Because here's what almost no one explains clearly: female arousal isn't linear. It doesn't rise in a straight line the way most men assume. It rises, pauses, builds, resets, and rises again. The female nervous system is wired for waves, not a sprint. That's not philosophy, it's physiology. Studies from Rutgers University and the Kinsey Institute show that women activate multiple brain regions responsible for anticipation, emotional connection, and sensory buildup long before they reach physical climax. In simpler terms, her body doesn't want speed, it wants rhythm. And when men approach intimacy like a direct race to the finish line, they unintentionally override the very system designed to create the deepest pleasure. That's why so many women say they lose the moment even when everything started well. It's not because they're distracted, it's because their bodies weren't given enough time to follow their natural sequence. Think of it like warming up a cold engine. If you slam the gas pedal right away, it sputters. But if you let it warm slowly, everything starts working far more smoothly than you expect. Female arousal works the exact same way, and once men understand that, everything changes. And here's the hook that surprises most people. The single biggest mistake I see isn't lack of effort. It's too much intensity too soon, not because he's careless, but because no one ever taught him the timing that actually matches her biology. So the very thing he thinks will help her, more pressure, more speed, more focus, often shuts down the process before it even has a chance to build. But the moment men learn how that rise, pause, rise cycle works, They stop fighting her biology and start working with it. And that's when women experience a level of pleasure they didn't know their bodies could feel. And if you think that sounds dramatic, wait until you hear what actually happens inside her brain when arousal is built the right way. Because the next part is the secret that turns simple stimulation into full body electricity, and almost no one ever explains it correctly. When I talk about waves of arousal, I'm not speaking in metaphors. I'm describing a real neurological process I've seen play out again and again in my patients. And the moment couples understand what's happening beneath the surface, everything about intimacy starts to make sense in a way it never did before. Because female pleasure isn't just physical, it's deeply neurological, emotional, and timing-based, and the brain is the conductor of all of it. One of the first things I explain to my patients is that a woman's brain shifts through 3 major states during arousal, anticipation, amplification, and surrender. Those aren't poetic terms. They're observable stages backed by fMRI research from Rutgers University and the University of Wisconsin. In anticipation mode, her brain is scanning for safety connection context. In amplification mode, sensory regions begin to fire more intensely as signals from touch, temperature, and emotion stack on top of each other. And in surrender mode, the phase most men rush toward too soon, her brain finally lets go of control and allows the full experience to unfold. Here's the part that's almost always misunderstood. Those 3 states cannot be skipped, and they certainly can't be rushed. When a woman suddenly loses the moment, it's because her brain is forced into a state it wasn't prepared for. It's like skipping steps on a ladder. You might get away with it once, but eventually you slip. The female nervous system is designed to rise gradually because that gradual rise is what unlocks deeper pleasure. It's the stacking of sensations, not the intensity of a single one, that creates the dramatic results people talk about but rarely understand. One of my patients, a 47-year-old woman, once described it perfectly. She told me, "It's not that I need more, I need things to make sense together." What she meant was that her body responds best when the emotional, neurological, and physical pieces line up at the right pace. This is why timing, not force, not pressure, not speed, becomes the quiet superpower most men never realize they're missing. In the moment timing falls into place, the entire experience shifts from mechanical to electric. Now, here's where the shock comes in. According to data from the Kinsey Institute, over 60% of women report that their arousal drops not because of lack of attraction, but because their brain doesn't get enough time to transition between these states. In other words, the problem isn't effort, it's pacing. And pacing is something anyone can learn once they understand what's happening in her mind. And this is where things get interesting, because once the brain enters amplification mode, the body becomes dramatically more responsive, sometimes with only a fraction of the effort it took at the beginning. That's why in my clinic, I often see couples shocked by how quickly progress happens once they align with her natural rhythm instead of working against it. When the brain signals, "I'm ready," the body follows with an intensity that surprises even women themselves. And if you're wondering how to recognize those signals, how to know when her brain is shifting from one state to another, there are specific signs that almost every woman shows, even if she doesn't realize it herself. Because the next thing I'm about to explain is the exact moment most men misread, and fixing this one misunderstanding can change everything. One of the most surprising patterns I've noticed over the years is how many couples struggle simply because they're reading 2 completely different maps. What feels like mixed signals to him is often just her nervous system shifting between stages of arousal. And understanding these shifts doesn't just prevent frustration, it creates connection, confidence, and a kind of emotional chemistry that couples often describe as finally being in sync. When a woman's brain transitions from anticipation into amplification, the body begins sending cues that are subtle at first. A change in breathing, a softening of her abdomen, the way her shoulders relax or her hips shift ever so slightly. These aren't random movements, they're neurological markers showing that her mind is warming to the experience and her body is opening to it. I've seen countless women explain this in my office, often saying something like, I wasn't trying to signal anything, I just needed a moment to catch up. But here's where the breakdown usually happens. Many men interpret these early cues as hesitation or loss of interest, when in reality, they're signs her brain is entering a deeper stage of engagement. In other words, she isn't pulling away, she's aligning. And the moment couples understand this distinction, everything becomes calmer, easier, and far more fulfilling for both of them. I once had a patient who described the experience perfectly. She said, I wish he knew that when I breathe differently, it doesn't mean stop, it means I'm getting there. This is a pattern I've heard so often that I've lost count. The breathing changes, the body resets, the rhythm shifts. These are not red flags, they're invitations. They show she's moving into the phase where her body becomes exponentially more responsive, which is exactly where deeper intimacy begins. And if you want to understand why these signals matter so much, here's the scientific reason. The female nervous system amplifies pleasure only when it senses a match between emotional readiness and physical pacing. If the pacing outruns readiness, the brain activates protective circuits and everything shuts down. But if pacing stays aligned, the amplification becomes stronger with almost no extra effort. That's why so many women use words like flow waves or building pressure. Their bodies are describing a neurological crescendo, not a simple escalation. Now, here's the hook that always captures my patient's attention. Once you can recognize these early cues, you can also recognize the moment when her body is about to shift into a completely different level of responsiveness. It's subtle, it's powerful, and most men miss it entirely, not because they're inexperienced, but because no one ever taught them what to look for. And this leads us into the most important turning point of all, the moment when her nervous system flips into what I call the heightened sensitivity window. It's the phase where the smallest touch, the softest movement, the quietest connection suddenly feels 10 times stronger than it did a minute earlier. And if you've never heard of this window before, don't worry, most people haven't. But once you understand what triggers it, everything about intimacy changes. The heightened sensitivity window, the turning point, almost everyone misses. There's a moment, subtle, quiet, almost invisible, when a woman's entire nervous system shifts into a different gear. I call it the heightened sensitivity window because during this phase, everything she feels becomes amplified. Not just physically, but emotionally, neurologically, and even energetically. And what's fascinating is that most of the men I treat have no idea this moment even exists, even though it's one of the biggest determinants of whether intimacy becomes deeply fulfilling or quietly disappointing. This shift happens when her brain determines that emotional readiness and physical pacing are finally aligned. It's the point where the anticipation stage has done its job, the amplification stage has built enough momentum, and her system begins to open up in ways she cannot consciously control. Studies from the University of British Columbia and Princeton show that female sensory centers become significantly more responsive once emotional safety and pacing sync together. In simpler terms, her brain stops monitoring and starts feeling. One of my patients once described it as someone turning up the dimmer switch inside me, and she didn't even realize there was a neuroscience explanation for that sensation. What she was feeling was her brain's reward circuitry beginning to fire more intensely, creating a kind of internal brightness that makes even the gentlest moments feel richer, deeper, more connected. It's a threshold, and once crossed, her experience becomes completely different from what it was even a minute earlier. This is the phase where small gestures matter more than big ones. A breath, a pause, a shift in rhythm, a moment of eye contact. These things may sound simple, almost insignificant, but during the heightened sensitivity window, they carry an emotional weight that can't be replicated through sheer intensity. The female brain is exquisitely tuned to nuance during this stage. It responds to emotional presence, not pressure. And when men understand this, they stop trying to impress and start truly connecting. Here's the part that surprises most people. This window opens and closes depending on how well her partner reads her cues. If she senses that her signals are being understood, that her breathing patterns, her rhythm changes, her subtle movements are acknowledged rather than misread, her nervous system opens wider. But if she feels rushed, ignored, or overwhelmed, the window narrows instantly and the body pulls back. Not emotionally, not consciously, but neurologically. And this is why learning to recognize this shift is so important. It's not about performing. It's not about doing more. It's about being attuned, understanding when her mind is no longer analyzing and is finally ready to experience deeper sensation. My patients often tell me that this alone changed everything for them because once they recognized the window intimacy, stopped feeling like guesswork and started feeling like partnership. And if you're wondering how to identify the exact moment this window opens, there's a specific set of changes, physiological and emotional, that almost every woman shows, even if she doesn't say a word. And once you recognize those changes, you'll understand why pacing, not pressure, is the key to unlocking the kind of connection most couples think only happens in movies. The subtle shifts that reveal she's reaching her emotional and sensory peak. By the time a woman enters the heightened sensitivity window, her entire nervous system begins sending signals that she's on the edge of a deeper emotional and physical experience. And these signals, though often incredibly subtle, are some of the most important cues a partner can ever learn to recognize. Over the years, I've listened to hundreds of women describe these shifts in my clinic not as loud or dramatic moments, but as quiet transitions that they wish their partners understood. The first and most universal sign is a change in her breathing. Not rapid or exaggerated, but rhythmic, almost like her body is syncing to an internal pulse. Research published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine shows that women's breath patterns naturally shift as the brain's sensory centers increase activity. It's her nervous system telling you, I'm present, I'm connected, keep going exactly like this. And the reason this matters is simple breath is one of the clearest indicators of where she is, emotionally and neurologically. The second cue is subtle tension, sometimes in her fingertips, sometimes in her thighs, sometimes in the gentle arch of her back. Many men misinterpret this as discomfort or hesitation, but in most cases, it's the opposite. It's her body preparing for a deeper wave of sensation. One patient once told me, it's like my body braces for something good without me even realizing it. That alignment between anticipation and readiness is one of the strongest predictors that she's entering her peak window. Then there's the emotional shift, something quieter than words, but louder than anything she could say. Her focus sharpens, distractions fade, she becomes fully present in a way that's unmistakable once you know how to recognize it. This presence is powerful because it signals that her emotional and sensory systems are finally moving together, not competing with each other. When couples reach this moment, I often see them describe it as a kind of click, even when they can't explain it scientifically. And here's the part that always surprises people. These cues show up at the exact moment when a woman's brain becomes most influenced by emotional connection. This means that the way her partner responds, whether he slows down, stays consistent, or simply stays emotionally attuned, can be the difference between her body moving forward into deeper pleasure or retreating back into self-protection. It's not about technique, it's about matching her rhythm in real time. One of the most common patterns I see is this: when a partner recognizes these cues and responds with presence, instead of urgency, everything changes. The nervous system opens further. The moment deepens. Small gestures suddenly carry more meaning than grand ones, and this is when women often report sensations that feel layered, emotional, physical, and neurological all at once. If you've ever wondered why some couples seem to move together effortlessly, this is why. They're not naturally compatible, they're reading the same cues and responding to them in sync, and when that happens, the experience stops feeling like technique and starts feeling like connection. But here's where things get even more interesting. Understanding these cues doesn't just deepen the moment, it reveals something even more important. Because once you know what these signals really mean, you'll understand the single biggest mistake men make at this stage and how avoiding it transforms the entire experience. What I'm about to say is something I've observed so consistently in my patients that it has become almost predictable. Right at the moment when a woman's nervous system is finally aligned, when her breath, her focus, her emotional presence, and her sensory pathways are all working together, most men unintentionally do the one thing that shuts everything down. And they don't do it because they're careless, they do it because they care too much and think more is better. I call it the intensity jump. It's the instinct many men have to suddenly increase speed pressure or urgency the moment they sense she's reaching her peak. It comes from a good place, excitement, encouragement, the desire to help her get where she's going. But biologically, it often has the opposite effect. Because in the female nervous system, consistency is what deepens the moment, while sudden changes activate the very circuits designed to protect her from sensory overload. This is something I've explained to hundreds of couples. The closer a woman gets to her emotional and sensory peak, the more her system depends on stability. According to research from the University of Ottawa, abrupt increases in intensity at high arousal levels can interrupt the brain's reward circuitry and trigger a self-protective reflex, essentially pulling her out of the moment she was just beginning to enter. When women describe falling off the edge or losing it suddenly, this is almost always the reason. A patient once told me it's like climbing a ladder and having someone shake it right before I reach the top. That metaphor has stayed with me for years because it perfectly captures how fragile yet powerful this moment can be. She's not asking for less enthusiasm. She's asking for steadiness, for the reassurance that what's working will continue without being disrupted. In that steadiness, her body feels safe enough to move forward instead of retreating. And here's the surprising part: the smallest change can make the biggest difference. Even a slightly faster rhythm, a subtle shift in energy, or a sudden hint of urgency can signal to her brain that the moment has changed, and her body responds immediately. That's why couples who master pacing often experience a dramatic difference in connection. They aren't working harder, they're working smarter, staying aligned with the rhythm her body has already chosen. What creates the breakthrough isn't escalation, it's presence. When a partner stays consistent, calm, and attuned, the female nervous system doesn't just stay open, it expands. This is when women describe the moment as overwhelming in the best way, not because of intensity, but because their body finally feels trusted enough to let go. So the real question becomes, how do you know when you've reached the point where consistency matters more than anything else? And the answer lies in a final set of signals, emotional, neurological, and physical, that almost always appear right before the deepest connection happens. And once you learn to recognize these final signals, you'll understand why the most powerful moments aren't created by doing more, but by doing less at exactly the right time. By the time a woman reaches the final stage of arousal, the point where her mind, emotions, and sensory pathways are fully aligned, her body begins sending cues that are unmistakable once you know how to recognize them. These aren't dramatic gestures or exaggerated reactions. In fact, they're usually the opposite quiet shifts that reveal her nervous system has reached a place of deep trust and heightened sensitivity. And throughout my years working with couples, I've noticed that understanding these subtle signals often becomes the turning point that changes everything. The first cue is emotional stillness. Not silence, but presence. It's the moment where her focus narrows, distractions fade, and she becomes deeply connected to what she's feeling rather than thinking about what's happening. Neuroscience research from Emory University shows that during this stage, the areas of the brain responsible for self-monitoring begin to quiet down, allowing the body to experience sensation more freely. In simple terms, she stops observing the moment and starts living it. The second cue is rhythmic responsiveness. Women often describe it as my body finding its own pace. It may appear in the way she synchronizes her breathing or the slight way she adjusts her posture, almost like aligning herself with an internal current. These micro-adjustments aren't random. They're signs her nervous system is settling into a rhythm that feels safe, consistent, and emotionally grounded. Once this happens, the experience becomes far less about technique and far more about attunement. Another cue that many people overlook is the emotional softening that happens right before women reach their deepest state of connection. It's subtle sometimes. It's the way her voice changes. Sometimes it's the way she relaxes into the moment. Sometimes it's a simple sense of openness that fills the space between her and her partner. I've had patients describe it as the moment I stopped worrying about everything else. That release, quiet and powerful, is one of the strongest indicators that she's reached her emotional peak. And then there's the cue that couples often don't talk about, but feel instinctively, the intuitive pull toward closeness. It might be reaching for a hand, leaning toward a breath, or seeking connection through touch or eye contact. This isn't about intensity. It's about emotional synchronization. When this happens, the moment becomes something deeper than physical pleasure. It becomes a shared experience, one that leaves a lasting imprint long after the moment ends. What's remarkable is how consistent these signals are across women of different ages, backgrounds, and personalities. I've heard them described by patients in their 20s and by women in their 60s, all using surprisingly similar language. I felt connected. Everything clicked. Time disappeared for a moment. These aren't coincidences. They're neurological patterns that reveal when a woman feels fully aligned, emotionally safe, and entirely present. And here's the part that most couples never realize when these final signals appear. Doing more doesn't create a deeper experience. Staying attuned does. It's the difference between amplifying the moment and overwhelming it, between deepening the connection and disrupting it, between turning the experience into something unforgettable or something that slips away. But this brings us to an even bigger realization, one that has reshaped countless relationships I've worked with. Because once you understand what alignment really means, you'll see why the most powerful moments in intimacy aren't physical at all, they're emotional. And that changes everything that comes next. That why the deepest intimacy isn't physical at all. It's emotional alignment. One of the most profound realizations I've had in my years of working with couples is that the most powerful moments in intimacy don't come from anything physical. They come from emotional alignment, the quiet, unspoken connection that forms when two people aren't just interacting with each other's bodies, but with each other's nervous systems. It's the difference between an experience that feels temporary and one that lingers, reshapes trust, heals distance, and creates the kind of closeness that couples often spend years searching for. When a woman reaches a peak state of emotional presence, something remarkable happens in her brain. The centers responsible for vigilance and self-protection begin to quiet down, while the circuits tied to trust bonding and affection light up. Neuroscientists often refer to this as the relational resonance state, and it's the same state associated with deep connection, emotional safety, and long-term bonding. It's not about what's happening in the moment. It's about how the moment makes her feel about the person she's with. This is why the couples who thrive aren't the ones who know the most techniques. They're the ones who understand each other's emotional rhythm. They pay attention. They stay present. They care about how the other person feels, not just how they respond. And what I've seen in countless sessions is that when connection replaces performance, the entire dynamic shifts. Everything becomes easier, calmer, more natural, and far more meaningful. One of my patients, a woman in her mid-50s, once told me something I'll never forget. She said, "When I feel emotionally safe, everything else becomes effortless." That sentence captures more truth than most medical textbooks, because emotional safety isn't a soft concept. It's a neurological requirement for deeper intimacy. Without it, the body becomes cautious. With it, the experience becomes expansive. And here's the surprising part. Emotional alignment is not complicated. It's built through small moments, steady presence, gentle responsiveness, reading cues instead of forcing outcomes. These are the behaviors that communicate, I'm here with you, not ahead of you, and not against you. And that message alone allows the nervous system to open in ways that create a deeper, richer experience that extends well beyond anything physical. What I often tell my patients is this: connection is the multiplier. You can have perfect knowledge, perfect timing, perfect communication. But if emotional connection is absent, the experience will always feel incomplete. But when emotional connection is present, even the simplest moments become meaningful. They resonate. They stay with you. They reshape the relationship from the inside out. And if you've ever wondered why some couples say they feel closer after a meaningful, intimate experience, it's not because of the act itself. It's because their nervous systems synced long enough for trust bonding and openness to deepen. That emotional synchronization is what creates the sense of closeness afterward, not the mechanics. But understanding this leads us straight into one of the most empowering realizations of all. Because once you know that emotional alignment is the foundation, you'll see why the next step isn't about doing more. It's about protecting the connection you've built. And that's where most couples unknowingly sabotage everything. As we wrap up, I want you to remember one thing deeper. Intimacy isn't about perfection, pressure, or performance, and it's about understanding each other's rhythm, respecting the way the nervous system works, and creating a space where both people feel safe enough to be fully present. Everything I shared with you today, from the early cues to the emotional alignment, is something I've seen transform relationships in my clinic, not because couples did more, but because they finally understood each other in a way they hadn't before. If anything from this conversation resonated with you, I hope you carry it into your life with patience and curiosity. Change doesn't happen from force, it happens from awareness. And when you start paying attention to the small signals, the small shifts, the small moments of connection, you'll be amazed at how relationships grow, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. You deserve a relationship that feels connected, confident, and meaningful. And if no one has told you this yet, you're capable of creating that. I see it in my patients every day, the transformation that happens when intention replaces pressure, when understanding replaces guessing. And I want the same growth for you. Before you go, save this video so you can revisit these insights whenever you need a reminder. And if you want more medically accurate, science-based guidance on men's health performance and long-term well-being, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I share new content every week designed to help men understand their bodies, protect their health, and show up with confidence in every part of their lives. And I'd love to hear from you too. Which part of today's conversation opened your eyes the most? What questions do you still have about male physiology or long-term sexual health? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and your questions often inspire the next video. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself, take care of your health, and I'll see you in the next video.